Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Or, in very poor Irish, Keira mila whaita, which is 100,000 welcomes to you all. And in particular, in an indigenous language of two countries that I now have roots in, a particular acknowledgement to the indigenous people of the region. It's a great honour to be here, and I have to say it's very impressive to see the number of people who are interested in teaching and learning. And I guess the theme of my talk this morning to set your conference off is the future ain't what it used to be. Particularly when we start thinking about transformation. That's quite a head-turning statement or quote, if you like. And by the end, hopefully you have a better sense of what the future might hold, but how the future is also deeply rooted in the past. And in fact, I want to start by just sharing a little bit about my own background, and hopefully not too egotistically. I'm now living, as Mike introduced me, in Dublin. It's a great city. Show of hands, how many of you have been to Dublin? Whoa, I can't tell many porkies then, can I? The Guinness is much better in Ireland, I can assure you. Well, in many respects, it took me about 140 years to return back to my ancestral homeland. In 1876, Fanny, who was 17, and Oliver, who was 23, 3 weeks married, set off on the Fernglow to New Zealand. And I can't imagine what that must have been like back then. We think we're pioneers. We think we're forging the new path for the future, creating a new future. But I just cannot imagine the pioneering spirit required to go to the bottom of the world. Remember, some people still thought the world was flat at that age. Fanny had a revolver, a pistol, sewn into her petticoat because she was going to a country of heathens. And we still have that, I should say, in the family. I know this history quite recently for reasons that I'll elaborate on because we have a book written about the family. It took 103 days to travel to New Zealand, and they arrived, some of you may have been there, to a very nice city known as Napier, a very unique city, the Art Deco capital of the world. From Napier, though, that wasn't their final destination, so they travelled 2 days by stagecoach. Half a day by horse, by horse, and then the final half day by foot to what is still New Zealand's largest farm station, known as Lochinvar Station in the centre of the North Island, sort of roughly where the map indicates. At the time, actually she didn't know it, but Fanny was already pregnant. The baby she had was the first European that the local Māori had, a European baby that they had ever seen. So this is still living memory when we're thinking about transformation, the past, and what might happen in the future. They, here, Fanny and Oliver, they lived well into, in fact, they went on, I should have added, you'll note, probably the wrong city for this, but you note the title of the family history, the McCutcheon family, the Super 15. At the time that refers to the rugby competition in this part of the world, or was, I think it's changed in name. They actually had 17 children, 15 survived, and they all lived into their 90s, so I'm claiming those genes. 3 went and fought in the First World War, served in Passchendaele, and all 3 came back, which statistically shouldn't have happened. So rolling this story forward a little bit, about almost 90 odd years, I doubt they could ever imagine that Mark Brown would be growing up in this small country village in New Zealand in a place called Alsthorpe in the Central Hawke's Bay of New Zealand. Some of you may even be familiar with this region. And I grew up in a very small country district where up until my teens we had no radio, no television, and very little communication outside of our small community. It was a fantastic upbringing, I have to say. As you can see, I had a wow of a time playing in tree huts, sunning myself as I did back then. I don't have many recollections of this, but it was a very sort of idealistic family upbringing in many respects. here I am. This is the whole school. You can see me there. I was 5 years old at the time of that photo. And moving forward, here I am. I was very fashion conscious even back then, as you can tell. And then perhaps one of my first recollections of the role technology played in my life was my Hornby train set. You see, we lived, which I didn't tell you previously, we lived in the country schoolhouse right next to the school. So school and education was in my blood, even though I'm a first in family, which is very important, and another message about the transformational potential of education. We had a front room that was very, very cold in the wintertime, and there was nothing in it, no furniture. It was like a living room, but we didn't, either were too poor or whatever, I don't know, no carpet on the floor, and that's where I set up my Hornby train set that I remember playing with vividly. The problem is that every now and again in a small country district, in this time of another yesteryear, if you like, or from the past, my parents would entertain local community, particularly the farming community, and it would be turned into a dance hall. My job was to sprinkle the dance powder. You can just imagine what it must have been like back then, grooving to that kind of sound. So I had to pack up my train set. So that was my biggest bugbear. Of course, growing up in New Zealand, you only could play rugby at that time. There were no other options. I'm pleased to say there are lots of other options now. There I am. I used to play on the wing. That's kind of because you hardly ever got the ball there. And rather than being called a wing, I probably would be better described as the drawback. It was not my forte, I have to say, in terms of sport. But I vividly remember my very first award that I got. Here it is, the Principal's Award for General Helpfulness. The award you get when they can't think of anything else that you deserve. But if you look more carefully, there's another element to this. Look at the signature. Kind of looks like Brown, doesn't it? And that person, the teacher, the principal standing there, happened to be my father. A little insider trading, but I still took the award. Here's my school report when I was leaving to go to secondary school, to high school. No parent's signature because this report was written by my father. It's always a little unusual. But you can see, back then I wasn't really a great scholar. Some might say I'm still not a great scholar. But interesting times. It won't take too much longer. So I went off to secondary school. I had to bus quite a long way, and then for a period I went to boarding school, which is not the most fond memory I have. And so I was always a little subversive, I guess. Perhaps academia suits me. And in the evening, because we now had radio, and I had a shortwave radio, so I thought I was pretty cool. Between about 11 and 1 a.m., I could listen to Radio Moscow in English. So I thought that was pretty cool. So that's a little bit of the geek in me, if you like, where technology comes through beyond my Hornby train set. But moving on, here I am. Of course, long hair was in fashion then. And one of my other vivid memories, some of you may be old enough to recall this, in 1978, one of the most, I guess, important inventions in the gaming world was the Space Invaders calculator. Anyone remember this? It's the reason I failed maths, because I had to clock it. And I did, but it took me about 6 months in class. And again, I guess there's this trend of, I had this interest in new technology, linked to learning, I guess. Here I am, long hair, even more in vogue at this time. And my other recollection, and I'll come to a wrap-up here in a second in terms of my background, but my other recollection is I was lazy as a student in many respects. I certainly was no scholar, as I've established, and I never took notes. I could never figure out why you would take notes. I did listen a lot and kind of made these mental connections, but I never took notes. Still don't take a lot today. The problem is, when it came to the final exam, notes were quite important because exams tended to examine the factual stuff, you know, what year was so-and-so born. So what I did was I paid someone to give me their notes for a couple of days, and then I sat and I recorded them. At that time, the only recorder we had was in the car with a tape. So I put them in there, and I would plug in a microphone and sit and record these notes. Then, this was the trick. I lay in bed, kind of went off to sleep, subliminal learning, no problem, I'm super prepared for the exams. Took me quite a number of years later to figure out it didn't work. Google's a great thing, I suppose. But you know what did work was the process of turning those notes into something on audio required me to engage with them and convert them and move. I didn't just read them out in a way that they were recorded, if I could even read the writing. So it did work in some respects. What's all this mean by way of an introduction? Well, I guess that background I've just shared with you, how could I ever imagine that, and I never went off to university when I finished secondary school, I did other things, how could I ever imagine that I would be now living in Dublin with a great job in a fantastic city? A city known as the Silicon Valley of Europe. If you're not familiar with Dublin, we have all of the ITs. Amazon, LinkedIn, PayPal, Twitter, Google, Apple. If you've seen the news just in the last week, you'll see that Apple are trying to, or being asked to give back, or not asked, they're being told they have to give back Ireland about 14 billion in taxes. And we don't want it back. We definitely don't want it back. In fact, the government may even fall on this very issue. So, I guess that original quote I gave you, the future ain't what it used to be, is interesting. And if I were to roll the clock forward for the generation and the 4 children that we have, well, they're not children, they're all in their 20s. In fact, one of the reasons we moved to Ireland is 2 of our sons were still living at home. They were in their 20s, and there was no sign of them moving out. It has been bliss. Anyway, I need to move on. I work at Dublin City University, as Mike introduced. It's a very similar university to here. We're one of these universities that likes to claim that we're in the top 50 under 50 or the top 100 under 50 universities. We're a young 30-year-old university, an ambitious, hungry university, and there isn't money in the higher education system in Ireland. You have no idea how wealthy you are here in Australia. I keep saying that to people. I know you're under pressures, but nothing like we're under. But the innovation it breeds is amazing. The transformation agenda, the drive for change without the funding. In some respects, there's a paradox in there, or almost an oxymoron. I went to launch the National Institute for Digital Learning, and I have a great opportunity in a small country of 4.5 million people to have an impact at a national level. I'm going to be here for the whole 2 days of the conference, and if I don't give you much time for questions at the end, I actually much prefer having the interaction with you in small groups and one-on-one. So by all means, come and have a talk with me, as Mike said, about what's going on in Europe. So one thing that the National Institute for Digital Learning, DCU as we call it, Dublin City University, and I think Swinburne have in common is we see ourselves not as future takers, but as future makers. The future's not something that we enter, the future is something we create. And if I give that, again, link back to my background, I guess what I was prepared with in my country upbringing, in a somewhat surreal surrounding, was the sense that we can make the future. And I think that's something you need to hold on to over the next 2 days. What kind of future do you want to make here, and how does that link to the experience for students? Because it's really important to keep the learner in mind. So that's a very long-winded introduction, which I apologise for, but hopefully it's set the scene, not just for my talk, but for what's also to come. I'm going to cover 3 things in the small amount of time I have left, and I want to, because I'm an academic, but I also like to problematise this whole field, because change is just part of what we do now, and we have to be, I think, as academics, and when I mean academics, I mean the community, not individuals. We have a really academic culture here. We have to think about the fact and confront the fact that there has always been a fickle dance between new technology and new ways of teaching and learning, or just teaching and learning, perhaps not new. Then I'm going to talk about the need to go beyond the basic steps, to create your own dance a little bit more, to some degree, as I've already indicated, in being a future maker. And then I'll just kind of put some very subtle points here about your institutional culture and the extent with which you need to think about how you teach against the grain. May run out a bit of time there, so that's something we can follow up. That's the general roadmap. What I want to do in this session is not give you handy hints. I don't really do that because I'm a fraud. I don't actually teach very much now. I just talk about teaching. I'm going to set the bigger stage and get you thinking. I know I've looked at the program really closely. You've got some fantastic talks, and I think that's where you're going to hear a lot more about real teachers doing things or lecturers doing things with students. So take with a healthy grain of salt some of what I have to say, and by all means challenge me, if not in this session, over the next 2 days. Without further ado, the fickle dance. Let's have a look at this quote here from Usain. The coming of the new media, the need for print on paper will rapidly diminish. The day will soon arrive when the world's literature will be available from the automatic library, blah, blah, blah. This quote, 1994, clearly refers, if you can take your mind back, to the invention or the first aspect of the World Wide Web. I think it was Mozilla, if any of you are old enough to remember that first browser for the World Wide Web. Actually, not. This quote comes from 1894 and the invention of the wax phonograph cylinder and how it was going to transform to a large degree the educational experience. So there's an interesting message here, and this is a little passé, I feel, these days, because lots of people use these sorts of quotes, but I'll just take your mind back, because there are lessons to be learned as we think about the future and the past. Here from Thomas Edison, books are going to be obsolete, and the motion picture is going to transform education. This one's probably lesser known, the 1912 one, because it refers to the invention of the videoscope. This is the one that you usually see, 1922, how the motion picture is destined to revolutionize education and replace textbooks. Not. Jumping ahead, if you look really closely, I won't read this one out, but if you look really closely on the image, you can see that blackboard hasn't really gone away, has it, today? This was the first sense in which we could video and broadcast lectures. And I guess one of the things that the image conjures up is how we take with each new technology our old way of thinking, our old mindset, our old pedagogy, and transplant it or supplant it onto the new technologies. Very important lesson here for us. One that, though, we haven't learned. These two that I'm going to show you are less commonly used, and they refer to the introduction of the typewriter. This first one I kind of don't totally get because I can't figure how or why they had a young boy there at that time. Maybe you have to take historians, put yourself back in time, and my stereotype here I have to challenge, but maybe this is a better image for marketing. Happens every day. Many so-called slow learners learn to type and then show up on the honor roll. So again, claims about the impact that new technologies are going to have on education. Perhaps by that time, it was much more stereotypic around who should be using typewriters. Because there is another element to this, unscripted I might add, is that new technologies are often linked to men, and men in leadership roles still dominate the field, I have to say. Then, one of the first, or the very first major technology-enhanced computer-assisted learning project known as Project Plato from the University of Illinois. Let me just show you a primary source video clip. The audio is not great, but it's just historical to see what the thinking was at the time about the potential of the computer to transform learning. Well, I guess how wrong he got it. But that thinking has not gone away, particularly in the schooling system, I should add. So these, I guess, tracing the history of various technologies over time, Larry Cuban published this very interesting little book back in, if I recall correctly, it's probably on the slide, 1986, called Teachers and Machines, the Classroom Use of Technology Since 1920. And he put this sort of technology expectation cycle together. To be honest, it's not something I really like that much, but it's a useful framework for you to think about. It begins with this period of high expectations. You've seen the quotes, bold claims about what technology will do for us. And then there's sort of growing support. We try to engender opportunities for people to pilot these technologies, test them out. And there's some early examples, but over time, the next step is where, well, somehow the technology doesn't quite mesh with the real environment, with the real classroom. And people start sort of becoming more critical, and over time they sort of lose their enthusiasm. And what Cuban says, again, I'm not sure I agree with this, but he says the final phase is then people get blamed. And notably, it's not the institution, it's not the design of the learning space, it's not the lack of funding to support the technology to really realize its potential, but it's the teachers, the lecturers who get the blame. And then he says this cycle continues. Well, I think it's a bit deterministic and a bit simplistic, but it's useful. Some of you will be very familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, I suppose, and in some respects, it's not dissimilar to what Cuban has presented. This is one of the reasons I'm also very critical of the Gartner hype cycle. It's a linear view of how technology works in society or in education, if you want to put into the place here. I've got MOOCs, you can see, are in this trough of disillusionment. In the US, MOOCs are kind of way past their use-by date. Actually, in Europe, MOOCs are huge, the massive open online course, the free course movement. Not as big in this part of the world, it seems. The reason I don't really like this is I don't think that's how it works. It's a very deterministic view. It underestimates the complexity of change, of transformation at an organizational level. It's technocentric, it's about the technology. It's not, perhaps also, I think in some respects, it's like a deficit view of people. It puts up resistance as the problem, that somehow people resist this. I don't see it at all like that. So in my thinking, I draw on this concept of digital resilience from Martin Weller and Terry Anderson. You can look up these references if you want or talk with me. What they see is an organization like this university is a large ecosystem made up of a lot of sub-ecosystems or subcultures, actually, sometimes at tension, or usually at tension. And what happens when you introduce a new technology, it leaves an impact, like any change in an ecosystem. Many occasions you can't predict what that change will be. It's so subtle, but there is a change because there's a change to the condition. And this concept of digital resilience says the organisms, the ecosystem that continues to survive and perpetuate itself as an ecosystem, as a healthy ecosystem, actually takes on adaptations. It's healthy to take on these adaptations. The core identity of the institution and even the individuals, the species within it, don't change. The DNA doesn't change, but its behavior and adaptations do change. And if they don't, actually, some species become extinct, like the New Zealand moa. And that is one reason why I draw on this ecological metaphor to talk about the importance of having an innovative, transformative culture as part of your organization. You need to be inside the ecosystem, willing to transform and bring these technologies to see what they offer, or not. But there's always some legacy. Mike used a more up-to-date slide than I did in introducing the Horizon report, which is this report often done annually, certainly internationally annually, to talk about what's on the horizon, and it draws on a Delphi technique of so-called experts in the area. One of the first things I did in Ireland is I did the first Irish Horizon report, and what you have on the slide there is last year's Horizon report for Australia, for Ireland, and then also for international. Interesting comparisons. The main reason I just have identified learning analytics is because I know tomorrow you've got Shane coming along giving the keynote, and learning analytics is seen as one of the next big things. Fortunately, I asked Mike yesterday, is Shane going to be here? He said, no, he turns up tomorrow. So I will also set the stage for you to ask some questions, because here's a quote about the potential, the transformative potential of learning analytics. And I guess there's a sense in which history repeats itself. Although bear in mind what I've just told you about an ecological approach to our thinking. I guess ultimately in this section what I wanted to leave you with as a message is we can be critical about new technologies and the claims that are made. If you draw on what I've just given you as terms of an ecological framework, actually what we really need to understand is the long-term impact this technology has, not the short-term effects. And I go back to the story I told you at the outset. I could never imagine a world with the kind of technologies that we have today when I grew up in that environment without radio or television. I wonder what it will be like in the future. So, looking at time, moving on then to this next section, I want to talk about the challenge of going beyond the traditional dance and learning new steps for new times. I want to introduce the fact, and I like to confront these debates. And there may be people who want to debate this with me, not here, but in the outside venue and over the next day or so, because there are still people who ask this question. Is face-to-face better than online? Because why are we putting all this investment into the online? And just recently, for reasons I won't fully elaborate on, I published a little piece in LinkedIn, and I understand it may have been circulated. So if you haven't read that piece, you might want to have a look at it after you've heard me, and I won't linger on this. But I tried to confront this question because it is fundamentally the wrong question for us to ask. As a research question, it's not a good research question. It sort of sets up this dichotomy. And to be honest, the new normal now is blended anyway. I'll elaborate on that. But more importantly, what it suggests is that face-to-face teaching is the gold standard by which we should measure all other forms of teaching. You know, when I was not taking notes sitting at the back of a lecture theatre like this, perhaps not quite like this, half asleep, for me that was not the gold standard of teaching. I'm a great defender of the lecture, I might add, the lecture, when done well. And we know that two lecturers do not lecture in the same way. So you can't take such simplistic comparisons. But I also think we have to fundamentally challenge our thinking about face-to-face teaching to the extent which it is really the gold standard anymore. I won't elaborate, other than to share with you a reference here, and primarily I'm just giving you this reference. It's got a hyperlink in the LinkedIn piece, because I know Shane's talking tomorrow, and this is a really, really comprehensive meta-analysis of the literature on online, blended, and distance education, which elaborates on some of the themes I've just left you with. What we do know fundamentally, if we really try to answer that question in a crude sense, is actually online, and whatever that might mean, is just as good, if not slightly better, than face-to-face teaching. But I think that's such a crude analysis, and meta-analyses often lose the fine grain. But it's certainly not worse. Perhaps I want to recast that question, though, and particularly because blended learning is such a focus here, with this question, which I know people still ask me and hold this view. It's sometimes not a safe question to ask, because it's just taken that everyone will accept this. Is blended learning really transforming traditional pedagogy? People think it is. It's what we should be doing. Is it really? Well, let's have a look. Initially, I think, and I like to frame things critically, is there's a lot of shadow dancing goes on when it comes to talk about blended learning. Kind of doing it, but what's it really look like? And how tangible is it? How do you measure it? How do you know whether it's any good? As Mike kind of intimated at the start, here's a classical definition of what we mean by blended learning. In fact, to answer this question, you've got to have a definition. It's interesting to hear that you're putting together some guideline standards of what it might mean here at this institution, which I think is entirely contextualized to the university. But this is the classical definition, not a definition that I'm that keen on, to be honest. It's been around for a while. You see, this kind of tries to visualize how blended learning might look like in a very weak sense of blending. You have this traditional semester, you have lectures, tutorials, or labs, or maybe crits if you're in the arts, or other variations. And in a weak sense of blending, sometimes we might substitute the crit or the lecture for something online, but we're still following a pretty traditional path. we haven't really done much that I would say is transformational. But we might be blending according to that previous definition. So for me, there's a lot of line dancing really going on when it comes to the use of blended learning. We're all kind of just still stuck in the one dance. Look at DCU and see what we're blending and how we're using new technologies.
PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, videos, YouTube.
And I French and business, so we use a lot of like translating software. Presentations, PowerPoint, and just kind of YouTube as well for videos.
By the lectures, it's mainly PowerPoint slides that I see them using, and some of them use a drawing pad kind of thing for drawing, and that's it.
In the classrooms, mainly PowerPoint. To be honest, that's about all I can remember, and some places they don't even have that. PowerPoints, and then the odd time there's smart technology, so smart boards for using in primary schools. So we get briefed on that quite a lot, how to use the smart board.
Generally, it's just PowerPoint presentations. What else would there be? Notes online. That's about it. DC website again.
PowerPoint, Word. It's all, Excel, everything like that. So that's really it, I think. Yeah.
So I've just undone my line about how DCU is this innovative, transformative institution. I saw a reasonable number of you nodding. This is sometimes as good as it gets. We're blending. Well, it's a form of blending. I'm doing it right now, I guess, in some respects. I would like to think that we draw more on the tradition of this kind of definition of blended learning, where it looks towards a fundamental redesign of the learning and teaching experience. And it's perhaps not that popular to say this, but I happen to believe not only a more effective experience, but potentially a more efficient experience, because there are always costs in teaching and time and dare I say it, but even money. So if we're smart about how we can use the technology. But sadly, in my experience, and I get to see a lot of institutions, we don't see a lot of this happening. And you see a lot of PowerPoint. So in many respects, when we're talking about blended learning and the hype associated with it, to some degree now, as I said earlier, it's the new normal. But during that hype phase, if you think of the cycle, there was a lot of flash mob dancing going on. But it didn't last very long. It was cool to start with, got exciting, it was good to be part of, but it just disappeared as quickly as it came along. And so I guess my challenge is I hope that's not where you're heading or where you've been, or if you have been, think more creatively. At the same time, I also acknowledge that small steps are okay. Everyone's got to start somewhere, and it's pretty hard to be transformational. What does transformational look like? So I think this sort of table here gives you a sense in which there are different ways in which you can transform at the micro level. Sometimes that's where it starts. Certainly having the appetite for some risk, for some change at that level. But ultimately, I see myself at the other end of the spectrum here in terms of what transformation we might be aiming for. In the concept of, though, transformation at the micro level, just a little concept that's useful to think of, and you might want to have a conversation with me, is this idea of wrapping. It's a key concept that related to blended learning. You see, in the past, learning design was something that we didn't really give a lot of thought to, not in the way we need to now, because there are so many more choices and decisions to make. And the wrapping of the face-to-face with what happens outside of class, whether that's face-to-face or online, is something we now have to think about and, in fact, can plan for, can structure for. So this is very important for us now of having tools to think about the design process. But I'm going to step back up out of the forest a little bit and come to a stronger sense of blending here, represented in this diagram. You've got the semester, and on this occasion, there's a little bit more opportunity for the learner to pick and path according to their needs. And there's opportunities where things have been substituted. The principle of substitution is very important because in the concept of blended learning, often if you're just adding new things, adding videos and the like, you may be doing your learners a great disservice because you're actually increasing their workload and their potential risk for failure because you've increased workload without taking something away. But here, ultimately, even though this looks a little bit more of a stronger sense of blending, if you can get what it means with the language conversion from module to subject, is it here? and module being the small topic in this diagram. Look what happens at the end. Exam. Really transformational, isn't it? Now, I have no problems with exams. Please don't take me wrong. There are all sorts of reasons I'm having to front up right now. This is a form of oral exam, if you like. I'll see how I'm going at the end with scorecards. But notably, when it comes to new technology here, we have this fickle dance again, this tension at work. We're now banning these things here from our examination halls instead of thinking about how we can grasp and use the technology in ways to be much more transformative and challenge some sacred cows. And in some respects, in danger of really overextending this dance metaphor, we're kind of shackling ourselves with one ball on our, or a ball and chain, and preventing us from really being transformative. And I think that's the hard part. How do you do this in a large organisation where there are certain things, rules exist? There are external pressures on us to have things like examinations. I don't have answers. But all I can say is a challenge, and Mike, this is a variation of your slide at the outset, is there's this leakage now that exists that is the new normal, regardless of your attitude to new technology and teaching and learning. And what we've got is we historically just designed for on-campus in-class, the yellow part. But now there are these other quadrants, these three other quadrants of learning. On-campus, out of class, you've got some great spaces here, and I know learning spaces is one of your priorities, some great spaces for that learning that takes place out of class. That's where I did most of my learning, I have to say. And then the off-campus in-class and off-campus out-of-class. Our students are doing this on the train and the tram. That's when they want to be accessing their technology, make use of their time. So for me, there's no option here. We have to be in that centre because the leakage is through all of those quadrants. And that's really where blended learning comes in. It's, as I said, a variation of the diagram Mike started with. Having said all of that, you note an element of cynicism, and I've shared some insights from my own institution, which is I'm grappling to be a change maker. I have to say the inconvenient truth is that blended learning is a very popular construct that is used very loosely and seems to mean different things to different people. And in fact, arguably, if I really push this metaphor, the concept of blended learning has not really disrupted the old normal and the familial 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 traditional kind of slow waltz that exists in large organisations. And that's the challenge for us, and it's not an easy one. I like to ground what I do in a little bit more research, so I will invite you, if you want to have a look more, and it might be something that the team could distribute electronically. This report came out earlier in the year. It's a very, very accessible read, quite a short paper, synthesising the literature on blended learning, and particularly challenging us to think beyond the old tradition and looking for better ways of doing things. This is not simple, it's complex. But when done well, the literature tells us quite conclusively we can enhance the learning experience, and if we're really, really clever, as I said earlier, also create efficiencies in our teaching. Ultimately, I suppose, coming from New Zealand originally, what I'd be challenging you to do is I think we really need a bold new dance. That's what I'm seeing myself and my role as a change maker in an organisation, but then I can't do it. It has to be done by you folk, or in your case. What is the dance that you see yourself, if you like, as a teacher embracing? Maybe it's a medley. So the final section, haven't got long to go, haven't got much time, I can see. What I want to think about is at the organisational level, if I take that ecological framework that I was using, this is an interesting report that comes out of the UK. Very different context, but many of the same change forces at work on universities and higher education. What it does is it surveys vice-chancellors, university presidents, mainly vice-chancellors in UK language, and deputy vice-chancellors, and asks for their perceptions of innovation and the challenge of innovation in teaching and learning. Notably, in response to this, predictions through to the year 2030, you can see that the online is not seen as particularly disruptive. We have all this language of disruption, but the one I've highlighted there, face-to-face, remains the dominant mode in their thinking. So when you've got that thinking at the highest level, that's really tough in terms of then a change agenda. And in summarising the report's findings, there are probably two points in particular. I've highlighted the last one, but perhaps the first one I should identify as well, is how we like to think universities are at the leading edge of innovation. But I think we have to be truthful, and some universities, very different than others. We're certainly at DCU, not Trinity College, and 500 years old with that kind of history. But there are very deep-seated conservative cultures or subcultures within universities, forces that work against change. And the final point there that I've highlighted, point 6, is that in many cases, this is still seen as marginal to university business. And I'll just elaborate, because for me, the work that Mike and his team is doing and your senior leadership here, if you haven't got the right culture eats strategy for lunch. You have to have the strategy, but you have to have the culture. And the culture comes from all of the people in this room and those who you influence as micro-leaders. Elephants in the room, I'll just gloss over these quickly because I've only got a few minutes to go, is we have to confront this issue. I've used the word efficiency more than once. It's not a dirty word. Teaching costs. And one of the elephants in the room is we know that teachers, lecturers, particularly in universities, are under intense time pressure, time poor. How do we grapple with that? There's a nice report here that talks about how time is the silent barrier to the adoption of new ways of teaching and learning with new technologies. If we don't confront this and introduce models and frameworks and ways to enable us, then we're going to have some serious challenges in our culture. Similarly, the status of teaching. Now, at DCU, like this university, a young, hungry university, teaching really does matter. But I'd be completely dishonest with you if I said it mattered at the same level that research does. And I haven't come across a university ever where research doesn't dominate teaching. Again, nice study here of Australian university websites. I deliberately put Swinburne's university website there because I wanted to see what was said about teaching, mindful of this study. And it's one thing you might want to think about, of what you're saying to your learners about the student experience and the way that blended learning or what experience they'll have per se. The final point I want to just share with you is we also need to understand, my story at the outset I hope demonstrates this, I cannot imagine what it will be like in 10 years, let alone 20 years, based on when I was in this country district in Alsop, New Zealand. So there is rapidly shifting ground. There are some who argue the whole word online is actually completely redundant. It's now, online is so the new normal that we shouldn't be using this word. And would we be branding ourselves and saying, Swinburne face-to-face? Except many universities are talking about X-University Online. I didn't want to pick you out here too much. We're marketing something or branding something that is a mode of delivery, not an experience. Now, I like to think this is probably my biggest achievement, to be honest, my proudest achievement in the short time I've been at DCU. We don't use the word online where we can, certainly not in interacting and promoting our online offerings. We introduced the concept of DCU Connected, which is not about the mode, but about the learner being connected wherever they are. And that might be face-to-face, actually, because it's not exclusively online. We were successful in even creating a brand new website for this, which was a little unusual because I'd not been used to being able to pull that one off in a university, a separate website. I mentioned MOOCs. I won't go over this with more than 30 seconds here because I'm getting the evil eye. For us, when you take an ecological view of innovation and transformation, for me, you have to be in the ecology, innovating and transforming to position yourself to evolve as the environment evolves and conditions change. So we're about to embark on a very ambitious new MOOC initiative. We're going to be using, I know you're a Blackboard user, we're going to be using in the first university in the world to be using Academy, which is a brand new MOOC platform. It happens to be built on Moodle. It's been developed by Moodle HQ here in Australia, in Perth. So Moodle have been developing this for about the last 12 months, 18 months. And it's very significant in Europe because Moodle is very large in countries like Portugal and Spain where there's not a lot of money in higher education because Moodle will accommodate the different language packs. And accommodate a form of, if I refer back to the acknowledgement to country, a form of cultural imperialism through this online learning free courses because 75% of all MOOCs, based on a recent report, are in English. So wrapping up, I won't worry about that one or that one. I can talk about those on other occasions. My slides are already on SlideShare if you want to have a look at them and go back to them. In conclusion, I kind of go over old ground here, but in 1876, when Fanny and Oliver set off as real pioneers, that's the kind of attitude I think we need. People to set up and create and make a future. And I'm not seeing us as transformative or innovative as we might think we are. And so 3 points to finish on. I think we need to have the courage to explore new spaces. Space is a metaphor here. Fanny and Oliver had no idea what kind of spaces and life they would create for themselves. So there are now 850 descendants from Fanny and Oliver. You have to design your own dance. Teaching and learning, there's no recipe to it. Everyone has a different philosophy. There's no one right, simple solution. You'll see some good examples, I'm sure, over the next 2 days, but they have to be your own. And I've probably overdone this point about being a future maker, not a taker. Don't take the future that's being given to you. This university has that deep in its DNA, I think, as being a change maker. And the final point, again, in very danger of stretching the metaphor as far as it can go, but it is raining today. With the storm, with the avalanche, whatever metaphor I used before, actually, this is the time to embrace change, to dance in the rain, to celebrate, to take risks. That's where real learning happens, or my saying as an academic is the light comes through the cracks. Let's expose those cracks and explore them. There's a lot of fun in that space. So thank you very much. I won't attempt poor Irish pronunciation and the thank you here, but my contact details are there. I suspect I'm now way over time, so we'll be with Mike as to whether you want to talk with me outside or we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
So put your hands together. I think a provocative presentation in terms of looking at being bold, I think embracing being a maker, I think is really important. We've got time for 1 or 2 quick questions. Now, students, Anthony, question. Put you on the spot. Since we're going to actually try to embrace this, if you've got some other colleagues as well. Any questions that come to mind?
I was actually putting stuff on Twitter. I was actually putting stuff on Twitter. One of the things that actually comes to mind when you were talking in part of it about how changing the learning structure and incorporating blended learning and that is back when I started my higher ed when I went to TAFE, was they do this test which assesses your learning style and whether you learn, visually, written, so forth. Do you think that going forth there'll be a space within blended learning structures to do more personalised teaching to those different learning styles?
2 comments, and I'll be very quick, mindful of the time. 1, for the record, and by all means ask me for the reference, but learning styles do not exist. And I don't want to put you, but the literature on learning styles, whilst there are advocates and almost disciples of that literature, the solid empirical literature on learning styles, just rubbish that area. So no personal comment there because it's such a popular concept. What I don't dismiss is people have different approaches to learning and bring different backgrounds. So it depends what we mean by styles. The second point, I think, is much more important about personalised learning, and I happen to know it's part of one of the agendas that you have. I was recently with Stephen Downes, actually last weekend, who's one of the sort of big speakers in the field, big thinkers. He made a subtle distinction between personalised learning, personal learning. You might want to unpack that slightly, but most definitely what the technology allows us is the opportunity to provide different pathways for learning. And if we don't embrace those opportunities, and to some degree, one of those slides I showed with the semester long tried to understand that. Not all learners bring the same background experiences, so shouldn't we understand what those experiences, so perhaps rather than an e-learning styles inventory, at the start, find out what they know. And why would we put them through the sausage machine if they already have some of that knowledge?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Anthony. Anything else? Yeah, one more question.
Is
that because students like or need to be ranked?
The question, as I take it, I think if we want to take that just a little larger, is we cannot underestimate the perceptions that learners bring to the learning experience. And even a room like this brings certain rules. And if I tried to do group work here, unless we had the smart flip around chairs and other things, it'd be very challenging. Now, people can do it. So, yes, I think, there is an element of this, but I equally think we need to encourage our students to be the ones that challenge us at the same time. Why do we have exams, though? Ultimately, because education plays a role of cultural and social reproduction. This is the bad side of education in many respects. We're sifting people. I happened to get through my schooling without taking notes because somehow I learned how to do exams. And I quite enjoy exams. But I don't think I was being measured on what I knew. I was being measured on what I had learnt or memorised. So I haven't fully answered that, but it's a very interesting question because I take the view that the learner voice is very important, but also sometimes the learner doesn't always know what they don't know.